Breaking news, President Trump threatening to shut down the southern border as early as next week if Mexico doesn't stop all undocumented immigrants from entering the United States.
We're not going to give them hundreds of billions of dollars and tell them that they're not going to use their strong immigration laws to help the United States. So there's a very good likelihood that I'll be closing the border next week, and that'll be just fine with me.
So what is happening on the Mexican border tonight? Ed Lavandera investigates.
Every day this week, buses have dropped off nearly 100 Central American migrants on the doorstep of the Good Neighbor Settlement House shelter in Brownsville, Texas. Most are requesting asylum, but the scene is sparking frustration among immigrant rights advocates as legions of volunteers scramble to help mothers and fathers with their children.
What we see is that our community is being instrumentalized as a tool in a larger political game that is completely antithetical to what the communities here want.
Good Neighbor Settlement is one of several shelters helping migrants suddenly released this week by Customs and Border Protection. The agency says it can't handle the massive number of migrants crossing the border.
Our immigration system was at the breaking point. That breaking point has arrived this week at our border.
CBP officials say Border Patrol agents are on pace for apprehensions and encounters with more than 100,000 migrants in March, which would be the highest number of monthly illegal border crossings in a decade. The Department of Homeland Security Secretary today is warning the system is in free fall. And President Trump says the tens of thousands of migrants requesting asylum are carrying out a big fat con job and is now threatening to shut down the border to control illegal immigration.
And we're on track for 1 million illegal aliens trying to rush our borders. It is an invasion, you know that.
Confundidas,
We met Vilma and her daughter at the shelter in Brownsville. They asked we not show their faces because they fear being returned to El Salvador. Vilma says she fled her home country with her daughter because they feared being killed. Gang members murdered her mother last year. Her daughter says 3 police officers unleashed a bruising attack on her in January, kicking and punching her for reasons that were never clear. That's when they decided to leave. Advocates say this is not a con job, but real people facing life and death consequences.
We are not ignorant here in the Rio Grande Valley. We know what's happening.
Immigrant rights advocates say the Trump administration is deliberately creating a sense of chaos with mass releases of migrants or housing migrants under a bridge in El Paso and giving families confusing paperwork.
This is one of the migrants here who asked us not to identify her, but these are the forms that they are given once they're released from custody here. And if you look closely here, this is supposed to be a notice to appear, giving them a date and time when they're supposed to appear in immigration court. But here, they're not getting those dates.
The Trump administration says there is no manufactured crisis on the southern border and that there is a real humanitarian and security crisis unfolding. So, Erin, critics say the Trump administration is simply trying to bolster its case for a national emergency to build more border wall. But the president's threat to close down the border is really sending shockwaves through this part of the world. You can see there the bridge in the distance that connects Brownsville to Matamoros. Millions of people depend on bridges and ports of entry like that to get back and forth every day. They go to school, work, see family and friends. Closing those ports of entry will have a devastating effect along the border region. Those ports of entry, those bridges, are a lifeline for these border communities. Erin?
All right, Eddie, thank you very much. And I want to go now to Democratic Congressman Raul Grijalva of Arizona. His district is along the southern border, joins me from Tucson tonight. So look, Customs and Border Protection says the system's at a breaking point. I don't know how much of Eddie's piece you're able to hear, but some of these numbers, 100,000 migrants apprehended this month, the highest in a decade, 40,000 children in custody, 60 migrants going to the hospital every single day. Do you believe there is a humanitarian crisis at the border?
I think there is a tragedy at the border. I believe that it is rapidly becoming a humanitarian crisis in the sense that this whole situation that we're seeing in the border, that we're seeing in the border area that I represent, is contrived, it's manufactured to meet a political end. You know, the president, Trump, declares the emergency, uses unilateral power to shift money to build his famous wall, and the consequence, now you have to justify it. And the justifications are what's causing the tragedy and what's causing the crisis. You know, of the 70,000 they talk about, they forget to mention that these people voluntarily come to the ports of entry, to Customs and Border Patrol, and turn themselves in seeking asylum, seeking refugee status. Those 40,000 children did not sneak across. They came and voluntarily want to be processed to prove their credible fear. This, you know, and now taking custom officers away from the ports of entry, which is a security checkpoint where 60,000 of apprehensions of drugs and individuals happens at that border, and removing them from there, and the threat of closing the border, an economic lifeline to the region beyond anything else.
So let me ask about shutting the border, because obviously he's now threatening to do so as soon as next week, as you just heard him say, Congressman Grijalva. So when you look at the Wilson Center, they've done the math, right? They're just looking at the border. Hundreds of millions of dollars a day in revenue from trade would be lost if you just look at the annual numbers. The president, though, is trying to spin this as a good thing. Here he is today.
With a deficit like we have with Mexico and have had for many years, closing the border will be a profit-making operation.
Do you agree with that? Profit-making?
For those states along the border and for the rest of the nation. This is about jobs. This is about one of our biggest trading partners. This is about visitation, retail sales, etc. It is an economic lifeline and to the region, back in both sides of the border. And to the threat of closure to the border is going to, whatever crisis they have been manufacturing is indeed going to become a major tragedy, both economic and in terms of humanity. And I think this threat is not, you know, the problem with his threats that they're not always idle. He could follow through on it, and the consequences would be horrible.
Speaking of threats that I hope are idle, I want to ask about one related to Puerto Rico, which is something I know very important to you. Your committee is holding hearings on Puerto Rico in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. The governor, though, Ricardo Rossello, spoke to our Jim Acosta yesterday and responded to President Trump saying, look, Puerto Rico is not spending money wisely. Here's what the governor said.
Does it feel that way sometimes? That you're dealing with a bully?
If the bully gets close, I'll punch the bully in the mouth. It would be a mistake to confuse courtesy with courage.
Do you support that way of speaking?
I don't, you know, the threat of violence is not the way to conduct a discussion. But, you know, given that, and with that caveat, you know, the governor is correct. This has been a pattern here, a pattern of disdain, disrespect, lack of equity, of treating the American citizens in Puerto Rico after the devastation of Maria, after their fiscal collapse, treating them in harsh manners, not wanting to give food stamps, wanting to cut the amount of support and recovery money that has already been approved by Congress. So my point is this is a pattern that this president has, whether it is the border, and he talks about invasion, or whether it's Puerto Rico. There seems to be a tilt that he wants to make people of color in this country his fodder in this coming election. Right. I think it's sad. I think it devalues all of us. And, you know, Puerto Rico needs help, and we're going to have hearings on that. But the issue with the president's taunt and threat is totally disrespectful and discriminatory, to be honest with you.
All right. Thank you very much, Congressman Grijalva. Good to speak to you tonight.